Oh, I have a question for everyone. Do you mind sharing your presentations, the PDF version of your presentations, with people who wish to have a copy?
Yes po.
Okay. Butch, okay. Anand, okay. Christine, okay with
Yes
you?
po. Yes po.
Eva also?
Oh, basta hindi ako makukulong.
You know, di naman she said, Anand, as long as she won't be thrown to jail. She won't be imprisoned by what she... Okay, so 1, 2, 3, and Nick. May we also share, Nick, your presentation?
No problem.
Okay, dear.
Right, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to our fifth WGDP webinar on women's economic empowerment, alternative work arrangements, and protection of the rights of women and men workers. So before we begin, here are the house rules. Participants other than the speakers and panelists are muted. You may ask questions to the panel via Q&A tab or the chat box. There will be an open forum where your questions will be answered. Lastly, help us improve our webinars by answering our survey. The link will be shared to you at the end of the webinar. Kindly indicate in the survey if you would like to receive a copy of the presentations. And with that, I now turn over the screen to Ms. Jean Ilo, Gender Specialist of UPPAF Respond and our moderator for this afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar of the WGDP Webinar Series on Women's Economic Empowerment. Welcome to Badette Caryaga of USAID, the GAD advocates who are attending the webinar, UPPAF Respond partners, and particularly to our Suki or repeat webinar attendees. As Jovel has said, I am Jean Ilio and I will be your moderator today. Now, for participants who are attending the WGDP webinars for the first time, the series of webinars aims to promote women's economic empowerment, either as workers or as entrepreneurs. The focus of the webinar series are key concerns of women entrepreneurs and workers as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The organizers of the series are the Regulatory Reform Support Program for National Development or RESPOND of the UP Public Administration Research and Extension Services Foundation, which is supported by a grant from USAID. And this UPPAF Respond has partnered with the Philippine Commission on Women for the series. As a USAID grantee, next slide please. The UPPAF Respond program on women's global development and prosperity is part of an initiative launched by the US government in February 2019. But probably more importantly, it also is our articulation of the USAID's gender equality and female empowerment policy. Our focus for the WGDP program is enabling women by removing restrictive regulatory barriers. This is in line with the focus of UPPAF Respond. At the same time, UP Public Administration Research and Extension Services Foundation is promoting the twin goals of gender equality and women's empowerment of the Philippine government, which is an advocacy issue that the foundation shares with the PCW. Initially, we planned on having only 5 webinars under the series. 3 in the first, 3 last year, and 2 this year. But so far we have 6 because we included the 4th webinar, which was held in November, on streamlining the Food and Drug Authority, Food and Drug Administration requirements and procedures for processed food products, which is a key area of concern for many women micro-entrepreneurs. So we have 4, one on access to credit, which was in last August. The next was on logistics with Henry Basilio as our resource person, held in September. The third was on online business, uh, and the fourth was the FBA session in November. This year we have two. The one we're holding now focuses on alternative work arrangements and protection of the rights of women and men workers. The last session, the last webinar, will be held in March as part of our celebration of the Women's Month. And it will tackle the question of, do or has the ease of doing business uh, help women entrepreneurs start and sustain their business? But that will be in March. Next slide. Okay, so what about the current webinar? The aim is to create an enabling environment for the economic empowerment of women workers. This is the only webinar actually that focuses on women workers. All the rest of the webinars were more focused on women entrepreneurs. The approach here is different from the previous webinars because the starting point of the discussion is as is a completed research study that was commissioned by the project, and our consultant for that study is Dr. Lanzona. So uh, for the webinar, we requested Dr. Lanzona to focus on alternative work arrangements and the challenges and opportunities for creating jobs and protecting workers' rights. Next slide. Now, this is our program. Uh, I'm explaining what the webinar series is all about. So then Dr. Basilio or Henry is going to give his opening remarks. Then we go to the main event, as it were. We have Boots Lanzona presenting his paper. And then we have the panelists each of whom will tackle a specific area based on where they're located. So the presentation of Boots will be followed by a discussion of key points by a panel that includes two from the Philippine government, the Department of Labor and Employment, Bureau of Working Conditions, and the Philippine Commission on Women. Then we have one straight from Singapore, from an international consulting firm that advises SMEs, among others. And then we have a woman labor unionist. An open forum will follow the panel discussion. At this point, I take great pleasure to introduce the UPPAF RESPOND Chief of Party, Dr. Enrico or Henry Basilio, to give his opening remarks. Henry?
Yes, thank you, Jean. Can you hear me?
Yes.
In loud and clear. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So for this year, 2021, this will be our first webinar of the Project Respond. But as already mentioned by Jean a while ago, this is already a fifth of a series of webinars on women's economic empowerment. So let me welcome all our participants, our dear participants, especially our Suki, no? In the words of Jean, those who have been following our webinars, no? Since last year. Let me also welcome those who are attending our webinar for the first time. So I hope you will also attend, no? Our sixth webinar in March. Let me also welcome and thank our speakers who will be with us. Of course, Dr. Lanzona will be presenting his paper, and in the panel of discussants, we have Mr. Bon, Ms. Balmes, Mr. Nandakurmar, and Ms. Arcos. Okay. Let me also thank the Respond team, who is the one organizing these webinars. And of course, last but not the least, Ms. Jean Ilon. Let me acknowledge her, who is moderating this webinar series. But more than that, she's our lead advisor on gender issues, and this spearheading response work on gender and women empowerment. Okay, so let me briefly tell you about the RESPOND project. RESPOND stands for Regulatory Reform Support Program for National Development. Okay, it is being implemented by the UP Public Administration Research and Extension Services Foundation, which is a partner foundation of the UP National College of Public Administration and Governance. Jean also already mentioned that this project RESPOND is being supported by the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. It's a 5-year project that started in 2019 and will be done by 2024. So we still have 3 more years now to do our work. Next slide, please. So this is in gist is the project RESPOND. The main or the overarching goal of the project is to improve the environment for trade and investment by making it more open and competitive. And there are 3 main objectives now for this project. The first one being market competition enhanced. So part of our task is to enhance market competition by basically reducing market entry barriers and also reducing, if not eliminating totally, regulatory burdens and reducing transportation costs, or rather transaction costs. Now, the second objective is in strengthening the regulatory capacity and governance of many of our regulatory agencies. So activities under this objective would be the strengthening of regulatory oversight and the strengthening of transparency and accountability mechanisms within our regulatory bodies. And then finally, the project also tries to encourage a greater participation from the public, from the citizen, and also industry and NGOs, civil society organizations, especially in the areas of advocacy, policy reform, and regulatory reform advocacies. So that in gist is what RESPOND is all about. And gender or women empowerment is an issue that cuts across all these 3 objectives of the project, which hopefully leads to that overarching goal of enhancing the environment for trade and investment. Okay, so with that, I turn over the floor again to Jean, so that we can start the forum proper. And I'm excited already to listen to the presentation of Dr. Butch Lanzona and the discussions that will happen after the presentation of Dr. Lanzona. Jean?
Thank you, Henry. Now, at this point, let me introduce Dr. Leonardo Butch Lanzona, our main presenter this afternoon. Butch Lanzona is a foremost labor economist, a full professor of the Ateneo de Manila University, a former chair of the economics department of the university, and former director of the Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development. This is from 2012 to 2017. He completed his AB in economics at the Ateneo de Manila, his MA and PhD in economics at the UP, University of the Philippines School of Economics, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Yale University Economic Growth Center from 1994 to 1996. A prolific writer and researcher, he has written on labor policies, and published in academic journals and contributed articles to various volumes, including the 2017 publication of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies entitled Unintended Consequences, The Folly of Uncritical Thinking. Butch?
Thank you very much, Jean. Good afternoon to everybody. I hope you can hear me. So let me share my screen. I'm a bit worried that I might not be able to share it correctly. Okay, I hope you see my screen. So this is my PowerPoint presentation. As Jean has mentioned, this is really just a small part of the research that I'm doing. But we thought that this is probably the more important one, in the sense that it's the most pressing issue in light of the pandemic. The pandemic has resulted to a labor market shock that needs to be addressed if recovery is to be achieved. In April 2020, the country saw a reduction in the number of employed to 33.8 million from 42.2 million last year. In July 2020, as the economy was open, actually the total number of employed workers increased again to 41.3 million, close to its January 2020 levels. The labor force survey, however, indicated that the observed improvement was due to an increase in self-employment, as there was a decline in salary and wage or what we call traditional employment. Furthermore, the July 2020 labor force survey found that the underemployment was higher by 1.3 million in July 2020 compared to the same period last year. This supports the finding of a UNDP survey which found that more than a third, or 68% of the households, reported efforts to cope with the reduced earnings. On top of these coping mechanisms was the search for additional sources of income. The presentation explores the different ways in which government can probably address this dilemma of underemployment and worker protection, as well as that of recovery, as economic recovery. The goal is not only to preserve health, but also to preserve jobs and ultimately incomes. Since the COVID-19 is expected to linger even perhaps into the next year or so, the study seeks to examine the opportunities and challenges offered by alternative work arrangements as a means to temporarily accomplish these goals. The outline of the study is as follows. Now, I'll first define the alternative work arrangements. There are many definitions, so it's really very hard to measure it. No? So given the labor force survey, this is how I was able to estimate how much alternative work arrangements we have. And then I look at the stylized facts based on the previous labor force surveys before the pandemic. And then I look at the opportunities for job creation in the face of COVID-19, and then later the challenges, particularly the protection of workers. Of course, we need to first create the jobs first, and then we'll look at lessons learned from the results that I'm getting and possible policy directions. Okay, so this is the definition that this is actually based on the literature. So, workers in alternative work arrangements include independent contractors, consultants, freelance workers, other self-employed workers, temporary workers, on-call workers, and contract workers. No? So maybe we can consider two categories, the self-employed and then the other temporary workers. Some of the self-employed are contractors and consultants who may have a permanent status with a firm, but earn non-regular payments. The definition incorporates much but not all of the informal sector, nor does it only include entrepreneurship. So it covers part of the arrangements also under contractualization and flexible arrangements. The crucial feature of these arrangements is the absence of any legal mandate to receive any benefits. No? According to the Philippine Labor Code, employees are not mandated to provide worker benefits unless there is a promise of permanency and the worker has worked for a minimum of 6 months, or the so-called probationary period. So firms may then engage in alternative work arrangements simply as a way to minimize costs and to avoid paying all of these benefits. For the employed, the issue is the lack of insurance that can allow them to carry risk and to withstand economic shocks. The illegality or legality of these contracts is thus a serious concern which needs to be addressed. More important, the productivity, sustainability, and welfare effects of these contracts need to be examined. For the self-employed, the lack of any support that will protect their earnings, their jobs, and their safety would be foremost. So these are the some stylized facts that I was able to get from the previous labor force surveys. The period is from 2010 to 2018. So in this first slide, for the whole period, more than 60% of the labor contracts can be defined under alternative work arrangements. This, however, is actually due to agricultural employment, where almost 90% are in this mode. For industry, the share on the average is about 61%, while for services, it's around 57%, based on the definition that I have made. The higher share for industry can be attributed probably to seasonal contracts, including outsourcing of certain activities. It is expected, however, that with more telecommuting, the share of the services may be higher. Now, this is the data that compares the arrangements for male and female workers. No? So contrary to expectations that alternative work arrangements are favorable to women since they allow a better balance of work and home activities, in fact, you will see a slightly greater proportion of males are engaged in alternative activities. For the female workers, a greater proportion of them are involved in agriculture, those who are involved in alternative arrangements, compared to the workers who are more in the services. So this suggests that women in services are more likely to engage in traditional contracts. And maybe because it's a little bit more difficult to enter these types of contracts in agriculture and industry. Third, as expected, the alternative work arrangements are associated with lower hours of work per week. This finding supports the idea that alternative work arrangements are chosen by both firms and workers for their flexibility. Workers in these arrangements are often assumed to accept this form of contract to gain experience or to be able to spend more time in various types of employment and work simultaneously. However, this assumption seems to be unsupported by this finding, given that, in fact, those who are engaged in alternative arrangements have fewer work hours. No? So we would often think that if you have in an alternative work arrangement, you can engage in different sorts of contracts simultaneously. But apparently, that may not be the case. No? Moreover, wage or earnings for those in these contracts are lower compared to the traditional arrangements. Hence, it may be likely that the probability of engaging in alternative work arrangements may be correlated with underemployment. And then fourth, the workers engaged in alternative arrangements are observed to have less schooling compared to workers in traditional arrangements. So this can explain why these workers are perhaps not hired in the traditional mode. Moreover, whatever they lack in schooling, they seem to have offset this in terms of age, which is commonly associated with experience. So these patterns seem to be more highlighted in women because they are apparently more schooled and more old, and they are older compared to their male counterparts in alternative arrangements. Now, if you look at all of these results, these findings seem to suggest a link between labor market conditions, the worker characteristics, and engagement in alternative arrangements. There may be two mechanisms that can explain for these relationships. First, it's possible that the workers, regardless of their preferences, may be using alternative work arrangements in a transition phase because of job losses and the difficulty of finding regular employment. So entry barriers to conventional contracts can be part of this explanation. Second, the relationship, another possible explanation for these relationships. These relationships may be the result of unmeasured preferences across workers for certain contracts. So for instance, if less educated and older individuals have lower preferences for traditional work, these workers will decide to participate in alternative work arrangements, even if the total earnings are lower. While the data may be limited to determine definitively the relative importance of these two explanations, there is some evidence that can shed light on this issue. The first explanation implies that the probability of engaging in alternative arrangements will decline with time as economic conditions improve. Conversely, the chances of accepting alternative arrangements is expected to increase in the face of job losses. The second explanation, which deals with unmeasured characteristics, have no such implication. So what I would like to do now is to show that, in fact, labor alternative work arrangements is actually a result of poor economic conditions, or more specifically, maybe because of certain difficulties in getting into these so-called conventional arrangements. A good way to test this hypothesis is to just look at the data, no? As a result of the pandemic. No? So the pandemic creates a natural experiment to test which of these explanations is more relevant in explaining the choice of contracts. No? The country's response to the crisis has been less than adequate compared to other countries. This is the data that I got from UNIDO, where they try to compare the performance of the Philippines in terms of responses to the COVID. They try to relate it to developing countries and to the world in general. And you can see here that the losses, particularly in terms of manufacturing, are much greater for the Philippines. So manufacturing productivity in particular, which earlier in the last decade was one of the sort what they call growth engines, showed dramatic downfalls, no, as a result of the COVID. The only bright spots seem to be chemicals, probably because of alcohol production and pharmaceuticals, no? Maybe face masks or so on. The general downtrend resulted in job losses. No? So this is the data from ADB. And you will notice that it was experienced in all sectors except for agriculture. No? In fact, there's some data that shows that there's a lot of migration to the rural areas. No? So the actual losses in jobs are in fact greater than expected. It can be seen, however, next slide, no? From the ADB estimates that along with full-time job losses, there was an increase in part-time work as individuals were looking for means to preserve their livelihoods. No? Also, a significant amount of workers that had jobs, apparently according to the ADB survey, did not work. No? But of course, I think these are what you may call, they're not really not working, but I think they are working at home. So they are always compelled to work by the company if they are supposed to be employees. No? So according to the AusAid report, 60% of the affected workers began working at home, and most of these employees whose jobs were suspended had had their work hours and pay reduced. So this suggests that, that these part-time jobs and those working at home are really another form of alternative work arrangements. And it suggests that in the midst of the pandemic, where there's so much difficulty in getting jobs, and most importantly, traditional jobs, then they are moving towards alternative work arrangements. And this might be the scenario for the next year or so. Now we could try to figure out also what the previous data has shown. So, I mean, before the pandemic, no, is there such a trend where if you have poor economic conditions, well, does that lead to alternative work arrangements? So one would think that trade and foreign direct investments are necessary in creating the right conditions for creating jobs, and also the environment for getting into the traditional work arrangements. So applying an econometric method, which is called multinomial logic, and using workers not reporting wages as base, we can estimate the probability of reporting a wage as well as categorizing them into two arrangements, the alternative and traditional, within an industrial area. As we all know, there's a lot of market concentration in the Philippines, especially in manufacturing. And that could be a source of market power. If you have these large companies located only in one area, then they could actually, in a way, be able to control the labor market, no? Because they don't have much competition from the rest of the country. So, given the pooled labor force survey, I was able to obtain the following preliminary results. No? First, expanding trade in industrial area raises the chances of workers to participate in alternative work arrangements, especially for the males. But actually, it turns out that if you have higher trade, this is net trade, no? Exports minus imports. It seems that the probability of women to report the wage is lower with more trade in industrial areas, no? Suggesting that greater trade outside industrial areas would be more beneficial to the women. It would enhance their entry also into what we call conventional work, no? Especially as if you move away from the industrial sectors, you're able to provide better options for other industries and firms. The second finding is that raising minimum wages in industrial areas improves the livelihood of men to report the traditional work, no? Meaning they get into regular work arrangements. But it turns out that it reduces the participation of women to do any type of work. No? So it would seem that the higher cost of labor as a result of higher minimum wages would cause women not to be employed. So this denotes that market power and imply that more alternative arrangements in areas outside of the industrial regions. Again, I'm using the industrial regions as my variable here. No? So if you increase the minimum wages in the industrial regions, it improves the chances of males to participate in traditional work, but not for the women. So that would imply again that if the minimum wages were to be improved in other areas, then perhaps that would result in more jobs for other people. But of course, the idea here is not maybe our goal is not to just increase minimum wages, but to make sure that the minimum wages are enough to provide decent livelihood. So it's important that you keep the wages stable and make them more secure, such as cash transfers. And this may be enough to encourage more work for the workers, especially for the women. A third result is that, surprisingly, increasing foreign direct investments in industrial regions reduces the probability of workers to report a wage. Apparently, based on the data that I'm analyzing, foreign direct investments are what we call labor saving or capital using. They lead to more capital intensive production. So these investments seem to be using more technologies that are capital using. evidence nonetheless shows increasing women and there's some evidence that show that if you improve investments in retail trade, however, that will actually increase the employment of male and female workers. So it would seem that the consequence of increasing foreign direct investments is to increase domestic trade rather than international trade. And then finally, while while schooling and experience are key factors in determining work and contracts, especially for the women, these findings support the notion that creating the right environment leads to more traditional work. In other words, schooling, the unmeasured characteristics are important, but the important thing is that you create the right conditions. Even though you may be schooled, but the right conditions are not there, the work might not be of good quality. So evidence would indicate that adverse economic conditions, even though you may be schooled or even though you may be more experienced, can lead to more alternative work arrangements. Now, another important challenge is the protection of workers. No? So to be able to determine the value of these arrangements to the workers, I consider the impact of such arrangements on wages. So along with schooling and experience, we can determine how worker choices of arrangements affect the wages. No? In this way, we can infer also from the model certain unobservable factors that can influence wage, such as gender discrimination. And the results are as follows. First, the market power of larger firms in industrial areas have caused wages to decline for both men and women. And in fact, the market power seems to be actually lower for alternative work arrangements. It's possible that the labor supply tends to be more responsive to wages. No? When you're in alternative arrangements, you can easily give it up. No? So if you think that the firms are not paying you the right wage, you can probably give up the contract. No? But if you're in a regular arrangement, there seems to be a greater chance for the firm to exercise its monopsony power, no? being only one of a few number of employers in that particular area. The decline in wages due to market power is observed to be 2 times, however, to be greater for women. Huh? So market power is found for both male and female workers, but it seems to be greater for the female. Huh? So this suggests the possibility of gender discrimination. In fact, women's participation in traditional work raises wages by 25.6%, based on the estimates that I'm getting, and men's participation in traditional work apparently has no effect on their wages. So it's again, the idea is that, regardless of the contracts, the males basically get similar wages. But for women, if they engage in alternative activities, they tend to have lower wages compared to those women in traditional work. So the returns of schooling are higher for women in traditional work. No? However, the returns from experience are greater for men, no? Indicating that firms put a premium on experience, and thus probably they're more willing to invest in males. No? So for women who would probably want to spend some time for their family, that might be a disadvantage. Okay, so I'm down to my last 2 slides. So these are the main lessons. First, that despite its inferiority, alternative work arrangements, including contractualization and flexibilization, have always been a main feature of Philippine labor markets. No? This stems from the difficulty in finding regular work and has become more prevalent in times of economic downturns, such as the pandemic. Workers may rationally choose to engage in alternative work arrangements, even though these contracts are devoid of any mandated benefits. Expanding economic activity may not increase workers' welfare and bring about sustainable recovery. The idea is that market power is detected, thus influencing technology adoption and lowering employment and wages. Lower productivity in alternative arrangements should be converted to high productivity contracts that protect workers' rights. Despite the seeming favorable benefits of alternative work arrangements, such as better work-home balance for both men and women, there is no evidence that the workers are actually better off. In the case of women, the data would seem to show that those women in alternative work arrangements experience greater discrimination. Hence, there's a need for a set of laws that will offer to create more regular jobs and greater protection for the workers. And finally, my last slide. No? So policy direction. So the recovery hinges on the combination of economic activity and worker security, especially health. And to do this, the resiliency of labor should be at the center of economic recovery. The crisis that we're facing is different from all the other crises that we have faced. No? Unlike before, it's capital that is being taken away from the economy. Now it's the workers. No? So it's not just a supply side problem, it's also a demand side problem. So to be able to make the workers more resilient and to strengthen the recovery, you must have the following. You have to strengthen social protection, to guarantee worker earnings. You have to improve access to health insurance, to guarantee worker safety, make technology more available, especially internet and so on. And then you need to expand regional development, especially people are moving towards the agricultural sector, which recently has been affected by so much typhoons and weather disturbances. Laws should be strengthened to secure workers in their rights. The evidence of market power and discrimination necessitates a re-examination of the requirements for decent work standards, especially for alternative work arrangements. So we should look at benefits in worker insurance, training and development, promotion and wages, including allowances. What is important though is that the workers and employers should be given enough space to negotiate contracts that are acceptable to workers and to make incentives for both parties to be compatible. The interests of both parties to be compatible. So the role of the state should really be just confined to the definition and protection of workers' rights. So that would include monitoring. Okay, thank you. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you very much, Butch.
Okay.
Now, let me introduce the members of the panel who will be discussing points that were raised by, or responding or reacting to points made by Dr. Lanzona. Our first discussant is Nicanor or Nick Bon, Chief of the Policy and Program Development Division of the Department of Labor and Employment, Bureau of Working Conditions. He oversees planning, organizing, and controlling programs, policies, standards, guidelines, and systems relating to wages, hours of work, and other conditions of employment. He joined the Department of Labor and Employment in 1998. He is a fellow Bicolano who got his law degree from the University of Santo Tomas in Legazpi City, or what used to be Aquinas University. The second discussant, I will be introducing the discussants in one go. The second discussant is Maria Christine Josefina G. Balmes, currently the Deputy Executive Director for Operations of the PCW. She also served as the OIC Project Manager of the second phase of the PCW Great Women Project. The third discussant, Anand Nandakumar, is Senior Advisor to FSG and leads FSG's efforts in Southeast Asia to partner with corporations, foundations, impact investors, and development agencies in creating and implementing meaningful, actionable strategies to address key development issues using the principles of shared value creation. And the fourth discussant is Eva Arcos, who is the National Vice President for Education and Information of the Associated Labor Union, or ALU. She co-chairs the Industrial Global Union Women's Committee and the Industrial Asia Pacific Women's Committee. A long-time labor union leader and women's economic empowerment advocate within the labor union movement, Eva was one of the lead advocates in the successful campaign for the enactment of the extended maternity leave law. Until recently, she was the woman labor representative in the Social Security Commission. May we now have Bon. After Bon is Christine. After Christine is Anand. Then Eva. Nick?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Chin. I will be showing you sharing screen, my presentation. Okay. So this is, again, good afternoon, everyone. So I will be discussing on policies, regulations pertaining to flexible work arrangement being implemented in the Philippines in the context of existing labor laws, as well as data on compliance. Okay, so given that we in the WWC is primarily involved in policy and program development and advisory functions in the enforcement and administration of labor laws on working condition. Having said that, we now directly go to what is flexible work arrangement. So under existing DOL regulations, when we speak of flexible work arrangement, we pertain or we refer to alternative arrangement or schedule other than the traditional standard work hours, work days, or work week. And we also should take note of this new law, Republic Act 11165. This refers to the Telecommuting Act. Because under this law, we have now the performance of work from an alternative workplace or outside the traditional workplace with, of course, the use of telecommunication or computer technology. Now, let's see what are these policies relating to flexible work arrangement that the DOLE had issued. So marami po yan. There we have a lot of policies or regulations regarding flexible work arrangements since 1990. So even prior to the pandemic, we already issued because we in the DOLE, in formulating policies, we always also look into the present situation then. So as you can see, we have here, since 1990, we already issued the guidelines on the implementation of compressed work week under Department Order number 21. So this was followed again, reiterating that policy. We issued Department Advisory number 2 in 2004. This pertains to the implementation of compressed work week scheme. Then later on in 2009, if I recall it right, during the global crisis, economic crisis then, so we have to adjust some of our policies. So we again issued Department Advisory number 2, guidelines on the adoption of flexible work arrangement. And then in 2010, we also issued guidelines on the implementation of flexible work arrangement and the exemption from the night work prohibition, particularly for women in the BPO then, which was issued in 2010. This is prior to the enactment of the night, the so-called um, night workers law then, so which amended some articles in the labor code. And lately, we also issued Department Order number 202, entitled Implementing Rules and Regulations of Republic Act, the Telecommuting Act. So these are some of the regulations issued by DOLE on flexible work arrangement. Let me just emphasize that these regulations or policies is being issued primarily to assist and guide employers in the implementation of various flexible work arrangement as one of the coping mechanism and remedial measures, particularly in times of economic difficulties in national emergencies. We in the DOLE sees it as a better alternative than the outright termination of employment or the total closure of the establishment. So basically, also let me emphasize this flexible work arrangement is not uh, forced, being forced to the workers. This is basically anchored on voluntary basis, and as such, uh, this should be mutually acceptable to both the employer and the workers. Now, moving on, as we all know, during this pandemic, the more that we have uh, created some flexibility that we cannot simply have to face-to-face interaction with each other. So that's why we also issued some flexibility. Foremost in mind is to preserve uh, employment and, of course, resumption of business operations. So we have here several issuances during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have here Labor Advisory number 17B, or the guidelines on employment preservation upon the resumption of business operations. So we also issued guidelines on employment preservation. This is a subsequent, so follow-up from the previous one. And also Labor Advisory number 11, supplemental guidelines relative to remedial measure in view of the ongoing outbreak coronavirus disease 2019. And on March. So these are some of the flexible work arrangement we deem fit at this point to cushion the effect of the pandemic and the effect to the economy as well as to the workers. Now we go to the specific types of flexible work arrangement that we're talking about. What are these? We have the telecommuting. So this is anchored again on voluntary agreement between the workers and management. So there is a need. Included here is work from home. So long there's technology involved and gadgets. Also, compressed work week. So from the word itself, compressed work week, you are just lessening the working days in a week, but prolonging the working hours within the day, but the total number of work hours within the week still remain. Okay, there is no diminution of benefit or salaries in this aspect. Now, we also have so-called transfer of employees to another branch of outlets. So as we all know, during the pandemic, some establishments have closed, some have engage as lessen or reduce their workforce. So the options could be that some employees are transferred to other branches which are or outlets open. We also have this the so-called assignment of employees to other position. So assignment of employees to other function or position in the same or other branch or outlet. What else? So another type is reduction of work days per week, per days or weeks. So we have asked some of establishment restaurant. So they have really suffered so much with this pandemic, so that they have reduced the working hours of their workers from from 8 hours, sometimes they only have 4 hours. From 6 days, they only work for 3 days. So necessarily, there would be reduction of salaries because we apply the principle of no work, no pay. Next is rotation of workers. It's similar to reduction of work days. So just rotating the workers, probably some workers will be asked to work 3 days a week, and some workers another 3 days, from Monday to Wednesday. Perhaps yung kalahati ng workplace will work, and the next succeeding 3 days will be the other workers. So rotation. So there would also be necessarily a reduction of salaries. So they will be paid only on the days and hours they actually work. What else? So partial closure. So this is inevitable. Some establishment can really sustain their operations. So they now have partial closure of operation. Not only small one, but big one. You see what happened to Shangri-La Hotel. So they have they have now temporarily closed. So partially or totally temporary. Then forced leave. So if it's they can also the company can also implement this one, forced leave. So they can utilize their work leave credits. Otherwise, they will be on no work, no pay. What else? Broken time schedule. So these are being done in normally in restaurants. So there's no diminution of benefit. Okay. So now, what are the important points with respect to this flexible work arrangement? First is this flexible work arrangement is subject some contingencies, like we have COVID pandemic. So this flexible work arrangement is temporary in nature. So kung wala na po yung ating mga emergency situations, pandemic, babalik na po sa normal. Kung may babalikan pa po. And second, this should be pursuant to agreement, okay? Consensual, a voluntary basis. And of course, we have to consider that there should be no diminution of benefits of the workers. So again, for those flexible work arrangement like reduction of work days, rotation of workers, necessarily there would be reduction of compensation proportionate to the reduced work hours, work days, and work week. And again, important point, we are requiring companies to submit to us reports because this is part of our monitoring because, you know, as we all know, government provides assistance like Bayanihan 2 and the financial assistance. So this is also a way for us to monitor what's happening in the field and what assistance government could provide to displaced workers. Now, in this, the implementation of this flexible work arrangement, what's really the how is it being administered? So basically, since it's anchored on voluntary agreement, it should be the parties that should primarily settle all differences with respect to the interpretation of how the flexible work arrangement will be implemented. And should the parties will not be able to resolve the matter, that's the time that the government will come in, interfere to conciliate, or NLRC. Now we try to look on some data here, data on establishment adopting the flexible work arrangement. So this is basically based on the report provided us. So as you can see, a bulk of this is on telecommuting. 63% is engaged in telecommuting. We also have followed by compressed work week, 12%. The transfer of employees, we have 2%. Assignment of employees to other functions, we have that 2%, and others, so on and so forth. So that's it. That's how we have captured the establishment on what is flexible work arrangement they have implemented or agreed upon. Now we go to the type of flexible work arrangement that they have implemented. So we have here based on women and female, the segregation. So here, it's glaring here that more female is affected by reduction of normal work days and hours per day or week. So nakita po natin yan, sila yan na namumulkag yan. And also rotation of workers, mostly female employees are affected as compared to male. On forced leave, so mas mataas din sila compared to men. So on other matters, it's normally for men. Okay. Now we go to my last part of my slides on compliance to JLS. So this is basically based on the reports from our region. So for 2020, the DOLE was able to inspect 14,659 establishments. So this data, as I mentioned, is generated from our labor inspection management system. So most of the inspected establishments were from micro enterprises or establishment with 1 to 9 workers, amounting for 44.42% of inspected, while small enterprises or establishments employing 10 to 99 workers comprised 37.6%. Inspected medium enterprises or establishment with 100 to 199 workers was at 5.67%, and large enterprises with 200 above workers was 12.35 of the total establishment covered for 2020. So the overall result of this year's annual labor inspection is inclined towards compliance. Despite the global public health, economic, and social issues brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, inspection data shows a significant impression of establishments' compliance to labor laws. The compliance rate nationwide for general labor standards and occupational safety and health standards in 2020 increased after inspection, which indicates the value of labor inspection in protecting the rights of workers and maintaining safe working conditions. From the initial compliance rate in general labor standards of 68% and 43% in OS, compliance rates after correction rose to 80% in general labor standards and 61% for OS standards. For 2020, the inspection points for general labor standards with lowest compliance rates were record keeping, non-coverage, remittance of social welfare benefits, and underpayment of minimum wage. While deficiency and underpayment of minimum wage, while deficiency in OS personnel, mandatory conduct of OS orientations, and failure to present safety reports were among the inspection points with lowest compliance in occupational safety and health standards. Okay, so that ends my presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. May now turn over the floor to our moderator.
Good afternoon. I think po na-disconnect slightly si Ms. Jean. So, I think we can proceed with the DG Christine.
Yes, good afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. May I ask to start sharing, please? I will turn off my camera just to make sure that I don't get disconnected. So good afternoon, colleagues in government, partners in development work, and in the private sector. I wish that Ms. Jean Ilio is back because I would like to thank her and UPPAF Respond team for again inviting PCW to provide our insights on various gender and development concerns in the series of webinars that we are conducting. In this session, I am going to share the gender dimension in the alternative work arrangements being implemented by public and private sectors to cope with the current COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So first, allow me to provide a very short background of what we do in the Philippine Commission on Women for the benefit of those present today who are not familiar with our work. Foremost, the PCW is the primary policy and coordinating body on women and gender equality concerns. We are created by virtue of RA 9710 or the Magna Carta of Women or MCW. Our mandate is to oversee the implementation of the MCW and lead in advocating gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. We also promote gender mainstreaming as a strategy by influencing development efforts of key government entities. So ang aming pong stakeholders are the government agencies toward gender equity and gender equality in the country. Next slide, please. Part of the salient features of the Magna Carta of Women, or MCW, under Section 22 of its IRR is the provision of decent work and equal access and opportunity for employment of women and to ensure a safe and hazard-free work environment, taking into account women's maternal functions. It further mandates the relevant government agencies to provide support services at the workplace to enable women workers to balance their family obligations and work responsibilities and to enforce laws that afford social protection for women workers. DOLE, DTI, and their attached agencies are the key implementing agencies responsible in ensuring that the private sector are following the basic requirements, while the Civil Service Commission, or the CSC, takes the lead in ensuring the government's compliance to the law. We have GSIS, SSS, and PhilHealth, on the other hand, to provide for the social protection needs of workers in public and private sectors. And furthermore, the law mandates that membership of workers in union, regardless of the status of employment and the place of their employment. So let me share with you some of the gender equality issues in labor and employment. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, gender disparities among women and men are already prevalent. While labor standards are in place, they do not seem to be enough to encourage women to enter and stay in the labor market. A key labor market indicator is the labor force participation rate, which was also presented earlier. So one of the issues that I want to discuss is the gender gap in the labor force participation of women. Far fewer females joined the country's workforce. In 2015, only half, or 50.1%, of working age females are part of the labor force compared to the 77.3% among males. And more recent data on labor force participation rate reveals a decreasing trend. For 2016 and 2017, PSA data showed lower FPR at 49.6% and 49.3% respectively. And as of March 2018, women's FPR registered at even lower 46.2%. The current trend in the labor participation indicates that the labor market in the Philippines is far from being inclusive. Next, the prevailing gender norms among employers and HR personnel. Discrimination of women in the workplace is still pervasive. A study conducted by Monster.com, a job hiring portal, showed that 39% of surveyed women claimed to have been passed up for promotion solely because of their gender, while 17% were asked if they have plans to start a family in the future. Next, pregnancy and maternity-related discrimination. When the primary consideration is profit, companies would prefer to hire men over women to get around payment of maternity leave, leave of gynecological disorders, and other leave benefits given to women. So women in the labor force, after giving birth, always have to consider returning to work immediately for fear of losing their jobs or resigning from work to prioritize taking care of their child. With the enactment of the expanded maternity leave law, some women workers are reported to have to face the same struggle with the nuances in the enforcement of the law in different company settings. Next is the Occupational Safety and Health of Women, or OSH. A gender-sensitive approach recognizes that because of the different jobs women and men do, their different societal roles, the expectations and responsibilities they have, women and men may be exposed to different physical and psychological risks at the workplace, thus requiring differing protection measures. For OSH policies and prevention strategies to be effective for both women and men, this dimension needs to be taken into account, and such policies must be based on more accurate information about the relationship between health and gender roles. And lastly, sexual harassment in the workplace. Over the last decade, the pervasiveness and cost of sexual harassment has become a growing concern at the national and international levels. The recent passage of the Safe Spaces Act provides women added protection to abuse and violence committed in the workplace. So these are just some of the gender equality concerns which we consider as top priority issues that we have been addressing. However, when the global health crisis brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic struck the world, these inequalities have been exacerbated as the world tries to cushion the economic impact of quarantines and lockdowns. Businesses, both in the public and private sectors, have experimented on various alternative work arrangements as a compelling solution to minimize the disruption of services and to avoid permanent business closure. Private companies refer to the Telecommuting Act and policy issuances from DOLE that was presented earlier and DTI, while the government agencies are covered by the CSC Memorandum Circular for the guidelines on implementing alternative work arrangements. The most practical type of AWA or alternative work arrangements is the work from home, which also becomes a common misconception that it is the only type of flexible work option available. In fact, there are other variations of AWA that was presented earlier by DOLE. And as government, private companies, and organizations continue to adopt better policies for business continuity, it failed to consider the gender aspects of this AWA, resulting to further increase in vulnerabilities and inequalities among women and men, girls and boys. This was also raised earlier and stated by Sir Butch in his presentation. So the policies on the different AWA variations are significantly widening the gender gaps in the labor market, considering the type of work and positions that women occupy. Women are employed in a greater proportion in sectors that are categorized as essential or frontline services. They have significant presence in the informal economy and may have lost their income during the months-long quarantines. They have lesser options of having jobs that can be done online or offsite, and they have greater participation in micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises or MSMEs, which are the type of companies that have been enormously affected by the crisis triggered by the pandemic. It should also be noted that not all jobs can be done remotely. Thus, considerations should be made for workers who are employed as medical frontliners, cleaners, security guards, and those who work at manufacturing industries and retail services. During ECQ, where stricter health measures limited the mobility and transportation of people, women who are employed in these types of jobs struggled their way to work, where they walked some kilometers, others have experienced harassments on streets, and some of them were pregnant women and elderly persons. Furthermore, gender gaps are amplified by what is happening within the home. For the work that can be done from home, women are to a greater extent in charge of the care of children, elderly, and sick household members and other domestic chores. In the Philippines, females spend a disproportionate amount of time on unpaid care and domestic work, while males spend about twice as much time on paid market work. The difference between the amounts of time spent by women and men performing this task has grown immensely during the pandemic. The closure of schools and daycare centers presented a big challenge for parents who not only have to care for their children, but also need to ensure a minimum level of homeschooling. This multiple unpaid care work has a direct impact on the opportunities for women to participate in the labor market. Those mostly affected are women in charge of their households as heads of family. Households led by single mothers are the ones that are more likely to plunge into poverty due to the impact of the crisis. As a result of these factors, the crisis has caused women to withdraw from the labor market, which translates into the fact that there are fewer and fewer economically active women. At the same time, it is increasingly worsening the conditions for those who continue to participate in the labor market. This has a direct and negative impact on women's income, economic independence, and the enjoyment of their rights. So the AWA, or the alternative work arrangements, pose a difficult challenge, but it also offers greater opportunities to lessen the gender inequality if given careful analysis. Flexible work is one of the main foundations for achieving diverse and inclusive workplaces. It also serves as a great approach in boosting work morale, increasing retention, and retaining the best talent. By cautiously choosing the type of alternative work arrangement, organizations should also consider looking into detail at the human interaction requirements and system readiness factors that apply to different roles, gender, and other vulnerabilities. When considering time and strategies, factors such as client demand, ability to remain in contact with colleagues and clients, and availability of technology will influence what flexible work options are fit for a certain industry. Overall, the effects of work from home arrangements depend a lot on the presence of dependent children and other household members. For parents, work from home during the lockdown may result in a negative experience with the potential increase in conflicts between work and family needs. However, as school opens again, hopefully soon, parents could fully benefit from a higher availability of work from home arrangements as the required technology is already put in place and work dynamics have evolved. In this time and age, running a successful business requires more than achieving profitability and generating revenue. It should now recognize the value and benefits of gender equality and women empowerment. So, Ms. Jean, I'm done po. Thank you very much.
Very much, Christine. Shall we now go to, so we had two discussants from the Philippine government. Now, let's call on two, say, non-government or private sector members of the panel. Anand, and then from after Anand, we will have Eva. Anand.
Thank you so much, Jean. It's a pleasure to be participating in this discussion. Let me just share my screen, that I have a few slides. I hope you can see my screen. Great.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, it's been a fantastic discussion so far in terms of the presentation from Professor and the government representatives. What I wanted to touch upon is very briefly introduce FSG, but then talk more about alternative work arrangements from the context of micro, small, and medium enterprises. And I'll try and keep it brief, and then we can discuss more during the panel discussion. So just a brief background on FSG. We are a not-for-profit consulting firm who are focused on social impact consulting. It was founded in 2000 by Harvard Business School professors, Michael Porter and Mark Kramer. And the purpose has been to advise foundations, corporates, not-for-profits, development agencies in areas related to social impact and complex social issues, using the philosophy of shared value. That is, how can you actually create business value while at the same time addressing social issues, and collective impact, which is bringing multiple stakeholders together to jointly address a common complex social issue. Just a brief example of the type of projects related to livelihoods, gender equity, and inclusion that we are participating in presently. In Philippines, we have recently initiated Project Castor, working with Restart Me, which is a Philippines-based NGO, and this project is focused on collective action aimed at building resilience for MSMEs and MFIs. In India, in the light of COVID-19, we have launched a multi-year program targeted at livelihood opportunities for women who have been disproportionately affected by this pandemic, with the objective of helping create 100,000 plus job opportunities for women from low-income households. And we work with corporates in trying to educate, create awareness, and jointly work with them to be more inclusive in terms of their hiring and retention practices through Talent Rewire, and at the same time being more gender sensitive and building gender equity in their workplace practices, as so eloquently explained in the previous presentation. With that, I'll jump into the topic for the day. Alternative work arrangements. Why is it so important from a micro, small, and medium enterprise perspective? First and foremost, if you're talking about work, MSMEs are the largest employment creators in the Philippines, and it's true for most developing and developed economies. So in the Philippines, for example, MSMEs account for 99% of enterprises and 63% of employment. Hence, any progressive improvement in alternative work arrangement policies or flexible work arrangement policies needs to understand the challenges and opportunities faced by MSME workers, because otherwise we are only addressing a very small portion of the overall employment opportunity, focused only on the larger amongst the medium enterprises and the large enterprises. That is why talking about MSMEs in the context of alternative work arrangements is very important. The second reason also, as was mentioned by the previous speakers, that MSMEs have been really badly hit as a result of the pandemic, disproportionately so. If we look at some of the ADB data for the Philippines, around between 44 to 55% of MSMEs are either temporarily closed or have seen a greater than 30% decline in revenues on account of the pandemic. 18% of micro enterprises, 45% of small, and 56% of medium enterprises report a reduction in workforce. At the same time, amongst the workforce, they've retained a large proportion, a significant proportion, around 22% for micro and 56% each for small and medium enterprises, reported reduced working hours for employees, potentially moving already out of necessity to alternative working arrangements. So, given MSMEs are so important to the economy and to employment, and the fact that their workers have been more affected and disproportionately so as a result of disruptions like the pandemic, all the more important to see how alternative work arrangements can be addressed, both from a challenge perspective, but also from an opportunity perspective. So the obvious question is, how do we go about looking at it? And there were some very interesting policy recommendations by Professor in the first speech, and Dole also seems to have rolled out certain policy guidelines. But the way we typically would add to that and look at it is that this is a very complex social issue. It is not solvable just by one or a set of policy guidelines or by certain enterprises doing the right thing. Unfortunately, for a complex issue such as this, the challenges and the flip side opportunities lie at three different levels. The first is at the individual or societal level. Ultimately, if we want change to happen, it needs to change in the mindsets and the mental models at individual, family, community, and society level. So there we see challenges in terms of, as already highlighted earlier, skill and education playing a part in the type of job you can get and the type of bargaining power you may have as an employee as compared to the bargaining power of the employer. Cultural factors, there are typically cultural factors which restrict, for example, women from entering the workforce, which inculcate a preference for a traditional job versus more flexible alternative working arrangements, etc., which also need to be borne in mind. And then, of course, for women, there are very specific concrete barriers which exist. Firstly, the time that they need to spend on unpaid care at home, whether taking care of the family or children, keeping the household, etc. There are also other issues such as norms on migration. So there, typically, migration is much higher in males as versus females, which means where the job opportunities are, they may not be actually able to go there, and hence they have to settle for less. And of course, there are the maternity-related constraints which have already been talked about, for example. In terms of one more challenge at the individual or societal level, there seems to be an inefficient access to professional or social networks amongst alternative workers themselves. For the formal sector, there are trade unions, there are formal mechanisms by which they can organize and build networks, whereas for the AWA segment, there doesn't seem to be any. So that these are the challenges at the individual level. Opportunities, of course, some of it can be policy driven, some of it involves public-private partnerships and civil society initiatives. Access to education, skill development is paramount. That needs to continue to be a focus, because that will automatically lead to better paying jobs and increased productivity. These need to be complemented by civil society initiatives to create that mindset change in terms of awareness on gender parity, respect for work, and to build social networks of flexible workers and those who are compelled to or out of choice choose that option. So those are barriers which are at individual societal level which need to be addressed. The second area is firm and employer level barriers. Here the key barriers are, one is lower wages for similar skill or job levels. This could be due to gender, this could be due to lack of provision of other benefits such as health and retirement, etc. There is, given a supply-demand issue and especially exacerbated by COVID-19, there is a higher bargaining power of employers given the reduced demand for labor. There is discrimination which has already been covered on the basis of gender or other differences, including the potential for workplace harassment, which puts people away from entering the workforce. And certain types of enterprises have more structural vulnerability, like micro and small businesses. The only way they address issues on the revenue or demand side is by having to kind of relook at their workforce and cut corners there. So what could be some of the opportunities to address this? There are several policy interventions that can be looked at, have worked differently in different countries. Setting a minimum wage limit at a per hourly, per day kind of basis, which is applicable both for flexible workers as well as for regular workers. Setting a policy on wage parity across gender, actually influencing employers by creating incentives or additional benefits for hiring women. That's something that actually could tilt the balance if they see a financial business incentive for hiring, for more equitable hiring. And providing an alternative, if employer is not providing benefits, trying to provide an alternative public option in terms of universal benefits. Continued employer education against discrimination for workers' rights, along with relevant redressal mechanisms, is another aspect. And access to resilient tools for the vulnerable enterprises themselves, the micro and small businesses, so that they have tools to manage their workforce and be able to kind of indulge in optionality in terms of flexible arrangements. So these are opportunities at the firm or employer level, which we see. Last but not the least is at the broader ecosystem level, which is not just the particular firm, but the broader value chain or the broader ecosystem that they are part of, the business environment. Here the issues are obviously structural issues with demand generation and growth as compared to labor availability. So if demand side is always lower than the supply side, then that will lead to higher bargaining power and fewer job opportunities created, leading to suboptimal employment and underemployment. Infrastructure constraints for education, skill development, even transportation and mobility constraints. One of the things in COVID-19 is workers stopped working because they couldn't find the public bus to go to the nearby town or from the village to the town to attend their workplace. So these are infrastructural constraints that need to be addressed, can be addressed. Lack of information on opportunities. The pandemic situation has exacerbated some of these. And while government policies can be effective in the formal sector, in the informal sector, typically they do not have an impact. And that creates a structural issue if a large portion of employment in the economy is in the informal sector. And last but not the least is the lack of adequate safety nets to address disruptions. So what are the opportunities, or how can some of these areas be addressed? Of course, continued investment and positive economic and trade policy to drive job creation, not just to attract investment or GDP growth, but focused on job creation and meaningful job creation. Clear policy and action to come out of the pandemic and protect employment to the extent possible and enable recovery. An interesting intervention is to provide safety nets, and sometimes this can be done through an alternative work arrangement policy as well. In India, for example, almost a decade or 15 years ago, there was this on-demand employment guarantee policy introduced by the previous government, where if you were out of work, especially in the rural areas, where again, a lot of the migrant labor comes from, the community could go and demand the government for jobs, for local village level infrastructure, like digging a well, building a bridge, or other such local needs. And the government is obliged to provide employment for up to 100 days a year for such people at a minimum wage. That is an alternative work arrangement policy. But what it also does is acts as a great safety net. And during COVID-19, there has been a 20-30% increase in demand for that program in India, especially from the migrant labor who have gone back to the rural areas. And it actually creates genuine assets in terms of new bridges, wells, etc. In this case, in the rural area. So that's an interesting policy alternative of using AWA creatively. Of course, continuing to encourage formalization and civil society advocacy, which this webinar is one example of that. Continued civil society initiatives for advocacy for better alternative work arrangement policy, as well as practices at the firm level and the individual societal level. So that's basically what I had to share. Happy to discuss more during the forum and yeah, take questions as well. Thanks a lot, G. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Anand. I've been like zooming in and out because of the power. We suffered from power fluctuation twice where I live. Okay, now let's go to Eva.
Okay.
Eva?
Yes. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Dr. Lanzona, Dr. Basilio, Jean, as the gender specialist, co-panelists, participants, brothers and sisters. Here are my comments on the study of Professor Lanzona and my take on current realities and select policy and legal environment or issues, and answers to the guide questions given to me by the organizers of this webinar. And this is from the woman trade union lens or perspective. So let me just, yeah, next slide, please. Labor force participation empowers women and men, not just economically, but also politically and legally. So any work arrangement is a basis for entitlements, rights, and privileges, for income and benefit determination, for organizing a union or a workers' association, to do collective bargaining, for mutual help and peaceful concerted activities, and for labor claims and protection from retaliatory actions. Next slide. So work arrangements are not just economic realities and concepts. They have legal and administrative basis and requirements in our constitution, labor laws, social legislation, jurisprudence, executive issuances, IRRs, company policies and regulations, collective bargaining agreements, bipartite and tripartite agreements and commitments, or even signed or ratified international instruments, among other things. So alternative work arrangements, as we have already seen and heard this afternoon, they're living history, becoming more present, part of conversations and policy and program concerns because of the pandemic. The definition, though, is not even exhaustive. As to contractualization, it has become the norm rather than an exception. There are those who promote or enter into AWAS because they fit or serve the personal or family, professional, company, and societal circumstances, like in this example, the pandemic, or the needs and objectives. But the question is, would a huge part of the labor force freely choose work arrangements that basically do not provide job and income security, counterpart social security contributions, and that do not provide benefits given to regular workers? And what about actual pay rates, including overtime and night shift differential, rent, rest and holiday pay, access to training and career development, safety, and health services? So just to show, we have some visual, there have been calls to end, for example, abusive contractualization or precarious work. Next slide, please. As to underemployment, whether it has to do with demand and supply issue, matching of skills and job requirements, or workers just trying to make full use of their abilities or even time, or because of inadequate income, underemployment can have complications. There will be this normalization of work beyond the 8-hour labor law, the risking of occupational safety and health, the negative effect to long-term productivity, to personal health and sense of well-being, to our family and social life. As to what may not work for women in most AWAS, salary differential during maternity leave. Can we have the text, please? Paid special or gynecological leave, or paid leave of victims of gender-based violence, employer counterpart contributions in legally mandated benefits, and their effects on 13-month pay and even retirement or pension pay. So in terms of take on the state of labor organizing during the pandemic, organizing has become more blended due to the pandemic. So face-to-face and online, organizing requiring further assistance in terms of digital tools and skills. In fact, in terms even of service. So the pandemic has shown the digital divide and inequalities, with disadvantaged labor and communities struggling to adapt, organize themselves, and survive. There is nothing new to being challenged or to being harassed, intimidated, busted, suspended, terminated, blacklisted, if you like, even red tag, wearied, and cash-strapped, especially by litigation, by companies being organized. There's nothing new to a government duty-bound and professing to serve the people, or a government being seemingly more sympathetic to business than labor. That in all doubts in the implementation and interpretation of the provisions of the labor code, resolutions are to be in favor of labor. I think really reality bites. According to government statistics, despite the pandemic, the number of labor organizations increased by more than 8,000. That's 8,643 from the fourth quarter of 2019 to the fourth quarter of 2020. 98% of which are workers' associations. Okay, in 2020, manufacturing continued to take more than half of the total registered enterprise-based unions, at 52.4%, followed by transport and storage, wholesale and retail trade, repair of motor vehicles and motorcycles, and then agriculture. Okay, the said industries are among those whose year-on-year employment statistics fell the greatest, especially in 2020. The data says 845 or 846 almost in manufacturing, 955.5 thousand in transportation and storage, and then in wholesale and retail trade, repair and motor vehicles and motorcycles, around that one, 2 million, I think, 29,000. So while thousands or millions were losing their jobs in these industries and in other industries, especially in high COVID-19 risk industries, unionization apparently had been successful. It is good news to us, if reported increase in union density is accurate. I've seen, I tried to look at the 2019 reports, official reports, government statistics, and I have seen numbers that do not add up. So that's why I'm saying there has to be hopefully a more accurate and updated reporting. Despite the supposed increase in number of labor organizations, existing CBAs decreased by about 15%. And while there are 17,820 enterprise-based unions with reported more than, it's almost like 1.6 members, there were only 800 existing CBAs, covering only 182,030 workers. So the disparity between increased number of labor organizations and the coverage, by collective bargaining agreement. So this is really a concern. Next slide, please. I'm almost there. Relatedly, the broader picture, shrinking civic space hampers our ability to organize, engage in trade union work, and to do legitimate and peaceful transformative actions. It means spending more time and other limited resources to defend and survive rather than to strengthen, to expand, and develop. There are many things we can do, or we have been doing, like, continue organizing, educating our Hanay, set the labor agenda, negotiate, and influence. We can critically participate in policy formulation, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. We want to do this so that we need to work for the creation, if there's none, or the inclusion in national, regional, sectoral, community, and enterprise-based decision-making structures, bodies, mechanisms, and processes. We can promote productivity and industrial peace, but that does justice. So it's not just peace for its own sake, you know. We can do public and media campaign to gather more support, broaden support, and then also again to influence policies or programs or any decision making processes that would be of good to the workers and of course the society. We can do all solidarity actions and more. Shifts to hours have made organizing work more difficult. With low unionization or low organizing of workers and their families, you know, with less organized and empowered men and women, we have weaker representation and participation. We have smaller voice. And this affect influence in agenda setting, in participation in governance, hopefully good governance, negotiations for work terms and conditions, for wage and benefits determination, in calling for accountabilities, in calling for compliance to and enforcement of labor standards, among other things. Because governance and labor advocacies must find fruition in inclusive decision-making structures, in sustainable development, decent work, equality, democratic spaces, non-violence, respect for human dignity, for life, for workers and women's rights, and injustice making. Thank you.
Very much, Eva. So during the past 40 minutes, 1 hour, the 4 discussants had covered one, Philippine labor standards, how they are enforced, and also labor directives that specifically pertain to alternative work arrangements during the crisis. The second discussion covered gender dimensions or gender issues that need to be considered when implementing alternative work arrangements. Anand discussed challenges and opportunities posed by alternative work arrangements to SMEs and their workers, looking at it from different level, societal, firm level, individual level, and so on and so forth. And Eva, the last discussion, as I teased the panel, with Eva, the last will probably say, that's what you say, but what's the reality? Okay, so there have been data and data. So one asks, how good are the data, and how do they capture? Now, which are the things that you'd like to respond to quickly before I
Yeah,
open?
I just want to point out a few points, maybe ask some questions. So in the presentation of Nick, I think it's very important to. I think he made a very important point that the government has made a lot of measures, no, to try to make the alternative work arrangements legal. And certainly that's also what we need. I mean, we need to clarify the rights of workers in these kinds of arrangements. We need to clarify how people should behave and so on and so forth. And then you mentioned the rate of compliance is being very high. But perhaps, I don't know, maybe I'm not saying that Dole should be in charge of creating jobs, no? But maybe what they should be focused more is in trying to understand what makes it difficult for workers to move from alternative work arrangements to the conventional ones. I think as I tried to show in my presentation, the reason why people are in alternative work arrangements is because they cannot enter this market. No? So, which apparently there seems to be a lot of barriers, especially for the women. So maybe more monitoring of the constraints that workers face in moving towards a more regular kind of work arrangement. Now, Director Christine of PCW also mentioned a very important point, no? That in labor force participation for women are very low compared to men. I didn't discuss that. No? It's part of the whole research that I'm doing. But I really just focused on people who are already at work. No? But certainly there's a need to look at that, and the fact that there is already a problem before the pandemic. What the pandemic did was to exacerbate, as in her own words, to exacerbate the situation. So the whole idea is that there's an opportunity now to address the past mistakes. No? So what is clear, maybe, what should PCW do now is to come up probably with more specific measures, no, on how we're going to deal with this. So especially after the pandemic, no? I mean, even if the pandemic is gone, there's still going to be the problems. No? But it's better to start now where there's a crisis where a lot of people are demanding for reforms. We need to be probably a little bit more specific. One of the main issues is the valuation of labor. No? How do you evaluate housework, for instance? So we women perhaps can be given some form of allowances, much like cash transfers and so on, because they're doing something. No? They're taking care of their children. They're making sure that they're healthy. So maybe PCW can come up with a little bit more specific ways of ensuring the safety of the workers, no? Especially those who are involved in alternative work arrangements. Now, Anand gave a very comprehensive analysis, and I really like the last slide, which is very, very, as I said, it's very systematic. He looked at different levels of intervention, different opportunities, and so on and so forth. But one question I have about MSMEs is, how much of these are really worth saving? I mean, it requires much more than providing support to them, but it also requires that we look at structural reforms, institutional reforms, so that we move them away from having small scale, which tends to be a little bit more inefficient. In the study that I have, trade apparently is not helping. It's not helping a lot of our people, because most of our people are involved in small and medium scale activities. No? So how do we make them larger, for instance? So what are the things that would be needed so that how do we address this issue about market power, for instance, right? So we could have all of these institutional reforms, but if firms continue to be concentrated and be able to have some control over wages, it might not work. So of course you might need a lot of trade policies, but we've been involved in so much trade policies already, but still it has not really benefited much. And so maybe there's a need to look more closely into how we are going to transform the structures, and to maybe expand the industries to the smaller regions. And then finally, Eva's presentation is quite on target. Right? There's a need for empowering the unions so that the workers will have a voice, and so they could the workers could bargain. In fact, it could be the solution to the market power. But my only question here is how do, I think she mentioned it also, no? How do labor unions now get involved in this situation where people are scrambling for work, right? I mean, if you're going to put more restrictions in terms of protecting workers, but the primary concern is to first find work. How should labor unions get involved in situations where people are forced to participate in alternative work arrangements. And of course, I suppose they're not members of any union. So how do you make the organizing at that particular level? How do you make the people involved in alternative work arrangements be part of the the bargaining that's done? We have this tripartite system. Is there a way in which we could involve people engaged in alternative work arrangements into this set of discussions and meetings for the labor sector? That's all I have. These are questions that I don't know the answer also.
Who wants a very quick response to Butch's response? Responsive. Any quick thoughts? Or I have two questions here from the attendees. One has to do with, actually, it's not so much a question as it is a comment, that pre-COVID-19 pandemic and even now, a lot of the contractualization that happens has to do with labor-only contracting. There are two parts to that. This actually labor-only contracting, some is a practice that's often found in small, medium enterprises that produce for export. Okay. What are the labor regulations with respect to what covers a labor-only contracting? That's for Nick. And the thing is that how much of the labor contracting actually is practiced not just in the Philippines, is practiced, but elsewhere in Asia? Because sometimes it's a way of reducing cost and also distributing risk. Okay, Nick first, and then Anand.
I think our existing regulations on that is clear. Labor-only contracting is prohibited. So that's it. So we have a DO on that, enumerating, providing safeguards when a company is engaged in labor-only contracting. What are the parameters? So there are sufficient guidelines on that, clarifying what are allowed and what are not. So I think we only have to strengthen the enforcement, the government. So that's it. And of course, there are other means, but also trying to engage the stakeholders, informing them that these are the rules that we have to follow, that you cannot simply engage in labor on contracting. At the end of the day, we have sufficient jurisprudence on that, where the Supreme Court has declared that this practice or practices are not allowed because this will belong to the so-called labor-only contracting, which is prohibited under existing regulations.
Yeah, so we have we have a labor standard, labor regulation covering that. But I think the limit, one constraint of the BWC is how what's covered by your inspections. You don't go to the micro level in the micro enterprises. How small are small enterprises?
We have to prioritize. To answer to your question, actually, diba, we are strategizing our inspection because we only have so much inspectors. That's why we prioritize. So for micro 1 to 9 establishments, we normally assist them, diba? So the technically, because they need government assistance. So instead of really imposing them the law, so we help them comply. We provide technical assistance so that they will be able to comply. But if the company is 10 and above, so that's where we really concentrate our inspection.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nick. Anand, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. So from a regulatory standpoint, I think different countries have varied regulations. In most of the developing countries in Southeast Asia, other countries, and also South Asia, especially more South Asia than Southeast Asia, it is still practiced. Not that there aren't regulations to protect workers' rights, but the issue is a lot of this kind of crosses the divide in terms of informal sector, and then enforcement becomes a huge challenge. And so even if there is some sort of regulation, effectiveness is very poor. The way it has actually increasingly being addressed is the moment they are part of a larger supply chain, which then eventually leads back to a large enterprise. And especially if it is a large national company or a multinational company, then this push towards responsible supply chains. So where I've seen it's worked is if there is a regulatory push more from the financial regulator in terms of governance requirements for stock market listing and so on, to ensure that your entire supply chain is responsible. So the onus is then on them to ensure that they source responsibly, and whoever they are sourcing from also, right? So they have to provide that visibility through the supply chain. That seems to be working, but having said that, that is still a limited portion of the economy, but at least that's a start, where ultimately if the pressure is on the dollar financially, then that starts having a cascading effect. One is the pressure on the dollar, and especially in export-oriented firms where the pressure is coming from the consumers in the consuming countries that So we are doing some work in Bangladesh with the textile supply chain workers where some of this has been practiced, where we're looking to address that. And it's not just enforcement and regulation. There has to be ultimately a market-based incentive, either in terms of loss of customers or governance requirements or loss of business from a large B2B customer, etc.
Like fair trade, like remember the fair trade draft?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Anand. I have a question here on from for Eva actually and Christine, and this has to do with, say, there has been gender awareness raising within the labor movement, right, Eva? Not just in ALU but in other labor organizations, workers organizations. Now, the thing is, what is the percentage of the leadership? This is a question from one of the attendees. What is the percentage of women labor leaders to total leadership in unions?
She answering first.
Yeah, this is a question actually for you. With more gender awareness in the labor movement, are there more women leaders, labor leaders?
There are many women leaders. Unfortunately, this is still part that we're like the participation in leadership. We're still working on it, advocating. This is not about us, but this is about the target of our advocacies because of that's history. I mean, part of history, you know, the inequality, the imbalances, the culture, etc., etc. And that is why we even have to ask. We talk about equality, but we want like 40% women representation in leadership structures. So it also has to do really with recognizing and opening the leadership of women. So they are there, but in terms of opening up, uh, whether the targets, the systems are not, we're still working on it. So uh, we're getting there, hopefully, but it's not being given to us in silver platter.
Yeah,
Uh,
because I think, yeah.
yeah, let me, if I may, while I'm here now, there were some comments or questions by Dr. Uh, Lanzona to me, which was about the empowerment of the union and how to involve people in discussions. I had a slide there of what unions can do. Actually, basically, that slide answers the question. But let me say this: workers, trade unions are not even included in discussions, many discussions, and decision-making structures or bodies or processes. We are already organized. Uh, there's a law that tells we have to be there. And yet, in terms of implementation, or sometimes things have been already decided, or kumbaga post-mortem lang then you complain, you say your comments after the fact. Because even organized workers are not being included. So how much more workers who are largely unorganized? So that is why I said we need to continue organizing, we need to educate, etc., because that's how we gather what the realities are, and what the positions are of the workers, and what we think should the policy or program direction should be.
Yeah, the Philippines, we keep on saying that if you look at the gender gap report of WEF, you say, oh, the Philippines is next only to New Zealand, so first gender equality, etc., etc. Especially if you look at laws in the Philippines, you say, oh, we have all the laws in the books. We have great laws, but the problem is how many of these laws are actually implemented, and a number of these laws has to do actually with representation of women or disadvantaged sectors in general in key bodies, not just the labor, not just where affecting labor, but also farmers and other sectors. Now, it's probably the question could be posed to PCW as the one with oversight for implementing the Philippine Magna Carta of Women. And part of that, an important provision is to do with representation of women. So, how do you monitor, and what happens when bodies that are supposed to have women representation don't have them, or don't have the proper representatives named into the committees or bodies or boards or whatever? Christine?
I Miss Jean. Well, actually, one of the reasons why we dropped from number 8 to number 18 in the gender gap index is because of the political participation of women.
Mm-mm.
Because we have lesser women in decision-making positions, and
In parliament, actually, or in Congress. Yeah, that's right.
yes, and as to the monitoring of organizations or unions or agencies who should have at least 40 or 50% of women in their decision making, or women leaders, it is not actually our mandate to monitor that. Our mandate is to monitor whether the agencies like DOLE are monitoring that and having and gathering the sex disaggregated data regarding women leadership in different companies and labor unions. Also, when it comes to um, lobbying for having more political leaders or more leaders, women leaders in general, it is part of the Women Priority Legislative Agenda of the Philippine Commission on Women, and we have been aggressively lobbying for this in Congress and Senate. There are a number of bills that have already been passed in both houses, and we are pushing for its approval, hopefully within this 18th Congress.
Yes, okay.
Jean,
Thank you very much.
Jean?
The reason why I sort of privileging that issue about women leadership positions or women's representation in bodies is that as we move from the pandemic situation to post-pandemic recovery, a lot of conversations are happening as to what need to be done. So the question about women's representation, women's participation has to do with, do women have effective seats in the table that discuss the recovery plans? So that is 80. Does anyone have a quick last word? Quick last word, last comment. We're
Jean,
11 minutes past
Jean,
4 o'clock. Yes,
may
yes.
I have something? Because you
Thank you.
mentioned about us, the Philippines, being in the usually
Six,
within the 10, in terms of ranking global. But of course, we know that meron siyang criteria di ba? Criteria in saying why we're number, 1 or 2 or 3 or something. So specifically, it was mentioned in terms of like political positions held by women, also in health, also in education, et cetera, et cetera. I think there are 4 major considerations there. But if we go, uh, from there, we go to, for example, enterprise level or sectoral, national. So like some of the questions that, has there been a change in worker, or workforce profile? Has there been a change and women participation in leadership, not just at the national level or in politics, but also at the enterprise level, or even among unions, like women leaders in unions? So these are some of the things. Has the gender gap in companies or in unions been bridged? Has there been a change in participation in training programs? Has there been like a women specific provisions in CBAs or et cetera, et cetera? So these are some, when we talk about that ranking, it talks about something bigger.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
but at our level, at different, like micro or something, a lot really has to be done. And of course, we're working on it. And as
Yes,
I said, it's not about us, but it is about the target of our advocacies.
yes, dear. Thank you. Before we end the session, there is a question here, and I think this needs to be answered. May I ask, where can the market power mentioned by Dr. Butch come from? It's in the chat box. According to my quick research, DTI Secretary Lopez said that 90,000 MSMEs closed in 2020. In the data of Cerbon, 3% of the establishments which adopted alternative work arrangements have closed. But what closed business, Dole Secretary Bellew said that 658,886 formal workers were given assistance by the Labor Department, and of the amount, 315,000 are OFWs under the ACA program. In December, data showed that 3.8% million lost their jobs. First question, do we have this sex disaggregated data, on how many lost their jobs in micro, small, medium, and large enterprises? Dr. Boots mentioned improving market power and increasing number of formal workers. But many large corporations are closing already. And banks which infused liquidity in the Philippine market last year amounting to about 1 trillion pesos, according to BSP Governor Jokno, reported the tightening of loans to enterprises and households. So may I ask, where can we source that market power that will hasten economic recovery this year of an economy that contracted by 9.5% last year? Okay, Boots, that's a long one.
Okay, let me just answer that very quickly. No, I define market power in terms of market concentration in industrial regions. So you would, as everybody knows, around 65% of the GDP are actually produced in only 3 regions, no? Like Metro Manila, Calabarzon, the Cebu region, and partly in Central Luzon. So most of the companies are there, no? The larger companies are there, and when they have become when the pandemic came, these are also the most populous areas, no? So that's the reason why a lot of the companies have closed down, because they're all concentrated in one particular area. And based on the regressions that I'm getting, it would seem that it has some negative effect in terms of, if you're in an industrial region, tendencies that you might actually get a lower wage compared to other people who probably didn't work in these firms, or they may have decided to migrate, or they may have decided to be self-employed. So compared to those people with the same skills and the same education, the people who are working in these regions tend to have a much smaller wage. So that's a very crude way of the whole idea is that if we're going to come up with a recovery, especially since most of the affected areas are in these regions, we need to move out of these regions and increase the power of the smaller firms in other regions in order to come up with a more efficient labor market. That's all I'm trying to say, basically.
Okay. There's a last question from Badet Kayaga. How many women and men have really lost their jobs, and what can we do with the extended pandemic? May I answer that for you, Boots? That will be
sure.
his report.
Yeah, maybe just a very quick point on what Professor Lanzona said in the question. I mean, it is a very complex issue, and especially with the pandemic, it is difficult if you look at it from an enterprise perspective also, because they also have to survive. So that is where I think increasingly government has to come in an intelligent manner, right? So not just through continued dole-outs and so on, but a couple of examples. So that also helps reshape market power, reshape which clusters develop within a country, and provides a safety net. So just to give a couple of tangible examples and how they have actually impacted. I gave the example of the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme in India. What that has done is, if there is an economic downturn, or right now in the pandemic, enterprises can't pay wages, be they in agriculture, be they in industry, and they're letting go of workers. But then government on-demand employment is available for productive assets. This is not just a dole-out. It is not just free payment that's given. There is already at the very local level some roster put up by the community on what are the assets that we need to build. This is a perfect time for the government to put in money to create a buffer employment, which creates productive assets as well. When industry recovers, this is on demand and they pay very minimum wages. This will go down automatically. but those productive assets still remain, which leads to further thriving of medium enterprises, further upgrading skills. If it is a local school that needs to be built, if it is a water supply connection or irrigation that needs to be provided, etc. That's one example where that wasn't the intended consequence. That is a positive unintended consequence that's happened over the last 10, 15 years, which means rural GDP goes up, which means industry is not concentrated just in those centers because there is demand coming from here. And government doesn't have to keep spending. It spends only in times where industry can't bear the load.
Yeah.
That's one example. The other on the women's side, which is very interesting, is how do you value unpaid work, housework, and how do you, can you create incentives for gender equity to get enterprises to hire women? And there are experiments in countries where, again, this is almost kind of giving a guarantee for women employment to say, okay, if you have to take care of the home and kids and so on, as a society, we will give you a bare minimum. That increases confidence, that increases the human dignity part at the very, very least. And second, that's complemented by creating incentives to get more women on the workforce, either through tax breaks, either through paying for training, paying for part of the salary, etc., for a limited period to increase participation in the workforce. And that could again have a virtuous cycle. This is not yet well established, but right now there are some experiments happening in this regard.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anand. About the rural employment program on infrastructure and, as you said, creating productive assets during the, I remember in 1998, during the Asian financial crisis, so many of these were tried out and they worked. So there were rural roads built and there were other rural infrastructures that came up. So experience is there. So, okay, at this point, I think I'd like to thank Butch and the panelists, Eva, Anand, Christine, and Nick, for sharing your time and your insights with us. But before you go, I would like to uh, our project, UPPAF Respond, would like to show you your e-certificate of appreciation. Okay, so we have certificate of appreciation presented to Leonardo A. Lanzona, PhD, for imparting valuable insights as main speaker in the WGDP Webinar Series on Women's Economic Empowerment, number 5, entitled Alternative Work Arrangements and the Protection of the Rights of Women and Men Workers, held on January 29, 2021, to be signed by Dr. Enrico Basilio, Chief of Party, UPPAF Respond. The webinar team will send you, or Muriel will send you the e-certificate. Thank you very much, Boots.
Thank you.
Next certificate of appreciation goes to Nicanor V. Bon for imparting valuable insights as panelists in the WGDP Webinar Series, etc., etc. Again, also, Muriel will send you the e-certificate. Next is to Maria Christine Josefina G. Balmes for imparting valuable insights as panelists, etc., etc., etc. It's the same thing. To Eva B. Arcos, also for imparting valuable insights as panelists in the webinar. And lastly, to Anand Nandakumar, also for imparting valuable insights as panelists. Before we close also, I would like to acknowledge the technical support from the UPPAF Respond team, especially Muriel Damsani, who you have met online. Okay. Jasmine Montenegro, Jubel Alzati, and Kay Bagas. I think the team has some announcements to make. Okay, take it away.
Thank you very much. Now for our first announcement. We will have our next webinar in March, right in time for Women's Month. It's entitled Ease of Doing Business is it helping women entrepreneurs start and sustain their businesses. This will be on March 12, 2021, the second Friday of March, and we will start at the same time slot, 2 p.m. Now for our second announcement. Again, we ask your help to help us improve our webinars by answering our survey. The link will be shared in the chat box, and also you'll see it after leaving the webinar. So this will help us continuously improve. And for those who wish to request for a certificate of attendance, please also answer the survey. Thank you very much. Back to you, Ms. Jean.
Okay, to all those who are still here, we still have like 92 people. Thank you very much for spending your Friday afternoon with us. Badette, thank you very much for joining us. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bud.
Thank you.
And thank you, Nick.
Thank you.